Our first speaker, Marianna Shreve Simpson, is independent scholar of Islamic art, has published, taught, and lectured widely on medieval and early modern Islamic art in general, and the arts of the book, especially Persian illustrated manuscripts. She holds a PhD from Harvard, and her professional career has included administrative and curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Art, the Freer-Sackler Galleries, the Smithsonian, and the Walters, as well as many visiting professorships across the country. Most recently, she served as president of the Historians of Islamic Art Association and as guest curator at the Princeton University Art Museum, and is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's been from 2012 on, and we're very happy to have her here, and particularly happy because today is her birthday. And Will Noel, who was the little bird who whispered this in my ear, insists that 20 years ago when she hired him at the Walters, she was 21 years old. So Shreve, happy 41st birthday. So please join me in welcoming Shreve.
Giving you a little bit of information, thank you. A little bit of information about the manuscript that I'll be introducing this afternoon, a one-volume copy or codex of the Quran of uncertain origin, richly illuminated and elephant size. And to highlight the physical challenges of working with this codex, here's Joe Shemtoff, the special collections coordinator at the Free Library. You'll notice that Joe and the manuscript are on the floor on the left, because that's the only way I could photograph the manuscript. And you'll be seeing more of that wonderful carpet in the manuscript room, along with some slightly fuzzy photos, because holding a iPad, even standing up and holding it doesn't always make for steady pictures. But before proceeding with all of that, I'd like to explain briefly how I came to work on this. Manuscript. Early last year, the Free Library asked me to help assess its 100 plus Islamic manuscripts, 100 or so plus Islamic manuscripts, in preparation for a project to digitize those manuscripts. And there was a grant that was being written, and now the grant has been awarded, and Kelly Tuttle, the project cataloger, is now on board, so it's all going forward. And at the same time, at the time of the assessment survey, number one, this manuscript number one, was not deemed a suitable candidate for digitization because it's very tightly bound and has some other condition issues, although the library is now, I'm happy to say, reconsidering the possibility. I hope that's true, Janine. Are you here? I hope you're reconsidering it. Yes, good, thank you. But even though this manuscript didn't make the initial cut for the digitization project, it was a star during the Rare Book School course that I taught at the Free Library last summer, and there we are looking at the manuscript cover, and Ellie is there on the left, hidden slightly by one of the other participants. Then towards the end of the summer, I got my hands on a newly released publication by Elaine Wright, who was the former curator of the Islamic collections at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. Elaine's book is an extremely thorough and detailed codicological study of a very beautiful Quran manuscript with copious illumination attributed to a renowned 16th century Persian artist named Rusbahan. And then, so when Nick Herman asked me if I would, or invited me to give a paper at this Schoenberg Symposium, I thought this would be an ideal opportunity for me to look at the illumination of the Free Library's Oriental MS-01 in a more substantial way, with the Chester Beatty monograph here as a kind of methodological guide. But from this, I trust you will understand that my research on the Free Library manuscript has really only just begun, and what I have to discuss today are really only very preliminary findings really more like initial observations and tentative ideas. But one point about about the manuscript that I can already be fairly confident about, on the basis of its hefty size, and you'll remember that the folio height was larger than the current 56 centimeters. So this is almost as big as that wonderful manuscript that Stella and Paola showed at the very end of their presentation. And the effort that's needed to turn the paper folios, and I can personally attest to the effort that's required for that. The certain point is that the manuscript would not have been conceived as a personal copy of the Quran. Rather, it was made for or used in an institution such as a mosque or a theological college or perhaps even a shrine. Such volumes are sometimes referred to as display copies, which makes them sound as if they were placed on book stands for show, just for display, whereas the free library copy shows signs of use, including, let's see if I do this right, that's a thumbprint right there, signs of use, some signs of wear and tear as well. And just an aside here, kind of to make more explicit what Renata Halad made implicit, is that within Islamic manuscript studies, the term illumination is used exclusively for manuscripts like copies of the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, that are embellished with non-figural decoration. Manuscripts with pictorial programs, this is the free library manuscript again, manuscripts with pictorial programs like Arabic scientific texts on your left or Turkish histories on your right are referred to as illustrated manuscripts. So this is an epistemological distinction between European manuscript studies and Islamic manuscript studies. And of course, Islamic manuscripts can be both illuminated and illustrated, like this very famous illustrated copy of Persian poetry, although, as you doubtless know, the Holy Book of the Quran can never be illustrated. And now to return to MS1. In the 1937 catalog of the Free Library's Oriental collection by Muhammad Simsar, the manuscript was dated to 1764, based on two similar dated inscriptions on gold bands at the bottom of the frontispieces facing folios, which also contain the name, the signature of the painter Hanzad Mahmud Masum, Ali, and that's where the two red arrows are. Simsar did point out that the inscription's initial words, here, have been effaced and posited that they named the manuscript's patron, although that can only have been a supposition since those bits are rubbed out, and you can see the one on the right is rubbed right down to paper, and it's totally illegible on the left. Kelly Tuttle and I did try the UV light to look at this and couldn't see anything. But what Simsar evidently did not notice, and what I didn't either right away, is that these inscriptions are written on strips of paper that have been carefully added to the bottom margins. You can see the line best, let's see, here. So to my mind, this casts doubts on the authenticity of the inscriptions and complicates the manuscript's history. And anyway, within the tradition of Quran transcription and illumination, the bottom of the opening surahs, that is the opening chapters of the text, is a highly unusual and overtly prominent place for an artist to sign and date his work. And the scale of the signature itself is ostentatious for a volume of the Word of God. The correct or proper place for such a signature would be, as on the Quran in the Penn Museum that Renata discussed, would be in the colophon for the finished piece, but this manuscript lacks that bit of documentation. It does not have a colophon. So one of my art historical challenges here when working with this volume, it has been its attribution, since the painting's assertion is not necessarily reliable. As my abstract notes, the study of Islamic manuscripts has long concerned illuminated volumes of the Quran dating from the earliest Islamic era, so the 8th and 9th centuries, through medieval and into the early modern periods, and coming in particular from core Islamic lands. Only recently has scholarly attention focused on Qurans from later times, that is the 18th and 19th centuries, and from marginal areas, marginal in quotes, such as South and Southeast Asia. Simon Redding, the leading specialist at the Smithsonian's Freer and Sackler galleries, considers 18th century India to be positively uncharted territory within illuminated manuscript studies, or illuminated Quran studies, I should say. As it happens, however, this is precisely where Simon and my other learned colleagues with whom I've consulted about this manuscript consider this Quran to have been made, so late 18th century India, without, however, anyone being able to point me to anything comparable. There's no comparisons at all. So it's a big help. So the closest that I've found so far are these two Qurans that were sold recently in London, both cataloged as North India, late 18th century. But where exactly in North India is anyone's guess, since as far as I can tell, virtually no art historical research has been published on manuscript production in this region, with the exception of Kashmir, and the Free Library manuscript does not fit the Kashmiri manuscript profile. I had a map here, but I took it out because we saw a beautiful one earlier, a beautiful one of India. Codicological features most suggestive of a 17th century or later Indian attribution for the Free Library manuscript include its overall proportions, the height considerably more generous than the width, its very thin polished paper, and you can see the wrinkles on the lower left side. Sorry, it's the right side, the right side, and the show-through of an ornament from the other side on the left-hand page. And other markers, other indicators are the beige bands that separate the lines of text. They were originally intended for interlinear translation in Persian. And especially the distinctive calligraphy, a very fluid, rounded, and at the same time crisp version of the same script used for the Seljuk period Quran in the Penn Museum that Renata discussed earlier this afternoon. So for the moment, I'm going to go with the attribution to late 18th century India for this manuscript. And today I won't be delving any further into either the implications of the dual frontispiece inscriptions or the absence of any ready art historical comparanda. Instead, I'd like to look this afternoon at the multitude of marginal medallions that embellish Manuscript 01, and to consider the following issues. First, the shape or forms, placement, and purpose of these devices. Secondly, their artistic or formal treatment. And third, what they can tell us about the workshop practices that created this impressive volume, even though we can't yet place it in a proper cultural or artistic context or chronological context. But I'm sorry to say I somehow managed to miss the symposium memo about multimediality and intermediality, so my focus today is exclusively monomedial. As I noted in my subtitle, my sub-subtitle, the Free Library's Quran consists of 439 illuminated folios, so that makes 878 pages. With the exception of the frontispiece folios, all the pages contain at least one marginal medallion, and quite a number have two or even three, as here. I haven't yet tried to count these devices, but would guesstimate over 1,000. Whatever their actual count, they take two principal forms, which for simplicity's sake I'm calling trefoil on the left and quatrefoil on your right. There are also a small number, and that's relatively speaking small, of vignettes in the shape of polyform cartouches, mostly square or rectangular-ish, and a minuscule number of one-offs, like the diamond shape on your right. But whatever their typical or atypical form, all the manuscript's medallions have finialed and pendental extensions projecting from their tops and bottoms. In and of itself, the proliferation of marginal medallions in varied forms and with extensions is hardly unusual within the history of Islamic art. From the earliest Islamic period onward, illuminated volumes of the Quran have included decorated devices, sometimes called vignettes, included these devices in the margins to facilitate the reading or recitation of the holy text and to help the reader or reciter in keeping his or her place. So it's a 14th century Quran I'm showing you on the left and on your right. And on the left is a folio from the Chester Beatty Library that Elaine Wright has just published. And here is a quick glossary. Typically, the marginal medallions in Qurans mark the 140 surah or chapter headings, generally set within illuminated frames. They mark the 5th and 10th verses of each surah. They mark the division of the text into 30 parts, each called a juz, and one to be read daily during the holy month of Ramadan, and places for prescribed required prostration. Interestingly, given both their profusion and continuous history, marginal devices have received little detailed discussion in the scholarly literature hitherto. What generally, and here's some details from a recent publication from the British Library that helps make some of these points. What's generally pointed out concerns their shapes and their accepted function, as I just reviewed. Another feature of these marginal markers, widely recognized as normative, is that they are inscribed or labeled with words for 5, 10, and prostration, and or with the number of a juz or a part of a juz, called a hizb. This is, of course, much more convenient than counting, and then remembering the beginning and end of the 30 individual text divisions, most of which do not coincide with the beginning or ends of surahs. As far as I can tell, however, neither convenience nor placekeeping were considerations in the illumination of the Free Library's Quran, since the vast majority of its marginal medallions lack labels. So I'll pick up this point later. So now to return to how to determine the specific as opposed to general role of the marginal medallions in this Quran and the distribution, if any, of the standard trefoil and quatrefoil shapes. The challenge here seemed to require a test case, so I decided to plot the 190 verses of Surah 10, which begins here on your left with the detail of the Surah heading on your right. Scholarly wisdom led me to expect that every 5th verse of a surah would be marked with one kind of an illuminated device, let's say a trefoil, and every 10th verse marked with another, like a quatrefoil, presenting some kind of a consistent pattern of illumination. Surah 10 soon disabused me of that notion. As you see, the trefoil medallion here is positioned at the first line of text after the surah heading. So the medallion marks neither the 5th nor 10th verse. In fact, its role is to draw attention to the beginning of the surah itself, similar to the palmettes or vignettes that are commonly found in copies of the Quran dating from medieval and early modern times, and the Penn Museum Quran has some of those vignettes. Throughout the Free Library Quran, every surah heading is accompanied by a trefoil medallion, positioned either next to the second illuminated heading, which contains the Bismillah, I'm going to print this right there, the ritual invocation, or the first line of text containing the surah's opening verse or verses. And this pattern, this use of the trefoil is the case even when the surah heading and the Bismillah are on the recto and verso of the same folio, or as here on facing folios. I'm sorry, I forgot to take out my little ID for the page number there. But to get back to Surah 10, the verso side of the surah's first folio, that's 300b, has a quatrefoil medallion and the facing folio a trefoil. And the next 5 openings also have a quatrefoil on the verso side and a trefoil on the recto, initially ensuring me that there was some kind of an alternating pattern. Although admittedly, the exact position of these medallions is not always mirror image. And don't worry, I'm not going to show you all of these. You'll see enough, but I'm not sure of it. And I assume that the alternation would align closely to the 5th or 10th verse demarcation, with the quatrefoils as 5 verse markers and the trefoils as 10 verse markers. It turns out, however, that the position of the quatrefoils is almost always a few lines below the line containing the end of verse 5, which is marked internally within the text by the letter ha, as I've put you there, humps, that corresponds to the number 5, humps. Meanwhile, the trefoils are always perfectly aligned, so look on the left-hand page, with the line containing the end of verse 10 marked with the initial form of the letter Ein. Furthermore, the trefoils do double duty. Besides marking the 10th verse, they mark the thematic sections or transitions in the Quran text, called ruku, and marked by the capital letter Ein, where bowing the head is required. Surah 10 has 11 such section breaks, but they are not equal in length, resulting in 2 rukus plus 2 10 verses, and that's 2 trefoils, that must be my next slide, yes, facing each other across the same manuscript opening. And by the way, the presence of marginal medallions marking these places for bowing is considered by some scholars to be primarily a feature of Indian and other Southeast Asian Qurans. Surah 10 ends on the right-hand leaf here, and Surah 11 begins with the illuminated heading standard for this manuscript, accompanied by a trefoil next to the first line. And so I would have expected that the illumination for Surah 10 would be comparable to its predecessor, featuring trefoils and quatrefoils. But it happens that the end of the 5th verse of this surah coincides with the beginning of the Quran's 12th juz, and is marked here, that's on the left side, with a large gold cartouche. Indeed, throughout the Quran, gold marginal cartouches appear at the start of every juz, and you'll remember there are 30 of them. The same device is often employed to signal the half juz, and sometimes even, as on the left, the quarter juz. The occasional coincidence of a 10th verse and the start of a juz explains the appearance of 2 different illuminated devices on the same page, with a trefoil for the former and a cartouche medallion for the latter. And do I have that slide? Yes. Like the trefoils and quatrefoils, no, I really meant this. Like the trefoils and quatrefoils, the cartouches for juz and half juz, or sometimes quarter juz, are pretty predictable, if much less uniform, in shape and size. But the form is sometimes modified, becoming larger and more elaborate when, for instance, the start of a surah and the start of a juz coincide as here, as if the medallions needed more ornamental oomph to mark such a significant textual conjunction. On the other hand, there are some instances where an elaborate cartouche appears unexpectedly. And here's one example. At the start of the second hizb of the 26th juz, get all this straight, not only has the medallion itself taken quite a novel form, but it is framed at the top and bottom by a rare pair of matching quatrefoils, making a very distinctive ornamental ensemble. Cartouche medallions serve still another function, namely to mark the location for prostration, or sajda. There are 14 such places in the Quran where a form of the verbs to prostrate oneself or to bend down occur in the text, and where prostration is required. The actual prostration comes at the end of the verse where the word occurs, and so the word I've circled in the darker red, and the end of the verse where you actually prostrate yourself is in the lighter red circle. In many early modern Qurans, such as the Ruzbahan one in Dublin, the word itself, sajda, is written in blue or gold ink in the margin. Instead, the Free Library manuscript employs cartouche or one-off medallions for this purpose, although, if truth be told, not all 14 places are so marked, at least I don't think they are, and this is an anomaly that I still have to figure out. The majority of the trefoil markers for ruku or bowing and the gold cartouche markers for juz, half juz, and sajja, like the ones we've just been looking at, have unadorned gold centers. Gold leaf, gold centers, like the one on the right. The exception, this is what I meant, the exception to this norm are the several dozen devices. Now, several dozen, that means out of maybe 1,000. Several dozen devices that are inscribed either with the number of a juz, a hisb, which is half a juz, or a ruku, or with the word for prostration. And there are varying explanations for the meaning of the numbers, but we won't get into that today. The notations are in general carefully written, usually in red ink on gold ground, and occasionally with the red ink outlined in white in an epigraphic style that is similar to the manuscript surah heading. So like the the image in the center is the one I'm thinking of. The appearance of these inscriptions seems quite random, however, and I do not believe that they were part of the manuscript's original production. Rather, they were later additions, presumably by or for someone who needed or wanted to annotate the marginal medallions, so supplementing the visual clues, with verbal cues. In addition to these interior annotations, the word hisba and sajda appear regularly in the outer margins, written in red ink in a very scratchy hand and sometimes a smudged hand. Many of these notes have been truncated, confirming that the folios were trimmed, as indicated in my subtitle. More to the point, however, in terms of reconstructing the initial artistic concept or scheme for this Quran, is that the illuminated marginal medallions clearly sufficed as signposts for the recitation or reading of the holy text. Glosses of the type added later, like these little marginal ones, were redundant and thus not necessary. So that's all I'm going to say about the margins of the medallion shape, placement, and function, and it's the most convoluted part of my paper because it's the one that took me the longest to figure out. We now may turn to the medallions as works of art of illumination, and I promise to keep this short. You doubtless already have noticed that while the trefoils and quatrefoils have uniform profiles throughout this free library manuscript, their color schemes and decor are extremely varied, even when they appear identical at first glance. While the design and palette of facing medallions like these can sometimes give the impression of symmetry, complementarity, and consistency, the overwhelming visual impact is of variety, individuality, and novelty. So far, I haven't attempted anything approaching a formal design taxonomy or typology, and this is one of the disadvantages of being an independent scholar, is you do not have a cadre of graduate students or undergraduates to help you with your work. So I'll just carry on. But I can give you some idea of the medallion diversity, even if I can't do it in a kind of statistical way. Some trefoil medallions have straightforward or simple designs, like the one, for instance, on the left. Continuous floral scrolls, for instance, against a monochrome background, while others contain a series of detailed motifs against a dotted polychrome ground, as on the middle and on the right. And here are some examples from among the manuscript's quatrefoils. The palettes of both trefoils and quatrefoils reveal a similar artistic contrast. Some of the colors are very traditional, with blue and gold dominant. That's one of the questions that came up at the end of Renata's talk. These are the classic color combinations for illumination of Islamic manuscripts, and in the middle is a strip of the medallions in the Chester Beatty Quran. While beautiful, the blue and gold, while beautiful, such a classic scheme appears positively sober when contrasted with the Technicolor Array, and here I'm borrowing from Sonia Drimmer's talk yesterday. I love that phrase, Technicolor Array, with neon shades and color combinations like these pinks, turquoise, and acid yellows. The cartouches are similarly diverse in their treatment. Sometimes their gold centers look like, and here we are, look like they were overlaid on top of a trefoil or a quatrefoil, and sometimes they seem to explode outwards, like this one on the right, far right, which I actually showed you earlier, with an 8-pointed star at the center and smaller motifs projecting on the diagonal. But the palette and decoration of the medallion's core elements, that is the trefoil, quatrefoil, and cartouche forms, are not the only variables here. The extensions also contrast throughout the manuscript, though again the basic configuration is consistent, alternating short vertical and horizontal lines in blue with small gold rondelles and polychrome pendants in decreasing sizes, and terminating at the top and bottom with semicircular motifs. They kind of remind me of googly eyes, and with a spear-like or arrow-like finial. Variations on the theme range in treatment from what I think of as robust on the left and skimpy on the right, with the former longer and with thicker outlines, so done with a heavier hand, and the latter shorter and with lighter outlines, so less blue ink, for instance, on the pen. But by the way, these extensions were laid out with a ruling pen, that is with a line scored into the paper, which is pretty amazing because given how thin the paper is. Oh yes, good, here I have an example. then using some kind of a straight edge. So you see that on the right-hand slide, right on image, you see the scoring line. And up on the left, in the middle of the trefoil, you see it again. So these were used to center these extensions and they're basically the centering axis for the entire medallion's ensemble. And with these references to hands and technique, we come to my third point regarding the manuscript's production process. You'll recall that the artist, Ghazan Masum Ali, takes credit for the illuminated frontispiece, and he all but brags, I didn't give you the whole inscription, he all but brags that it took him 6 months to complete this composition. But even if this turns out to be reliable documentation, remember that these inscriptions appear on pasted strips in the bottom. Even if this turns out to be reliable documentation, there is no way in the world that a single artist could have decorated the entire codex. And now you know, I know, where I'm going with this, right towards Nancy Turner's community of practice. The production of this Quran, including the transcription of the holy text and the illumination of its surah headings and marginal medallions, required an artistic team or crew, with members assigned specific roles. In other words, a manuscript workshop, of the type for which we have ample evidence from throughout Islamic art history, including illustrations in 16th century Indian manuscripts as here. The head of the workshop would have been an ostad, or master, and he's the gentleman with the green scarf in the image on your right. The ostad might also have been the director for this particular project, this particular Quran project. That is, the person who after determining the manuscript size and folio format, then plotted out where the marginal medallions should go and what form they should take in relationship to the Quranic text. The actual design and execution of these medallions, including outlining their primary shapes, and perhaps the trefoils and quatrefoils were done with stencils, I'm not sure yet. The actual design and execution, including outlining the primary shapes and painting in their colors and motifs, were done by various senior illuminators who may have overseen a number of assistant illuminators in certain tasks, like putting in the little dots in the center of the fields and outlining the trefoils and quatrefoils. Assistants also would have been tasked with the medallion's extensions. And I imagine that what I earlier called the robust extensions were done by experienced assistants. And here's one on the far right where the assistant got completely carried away and stretched the extension out practically to the whole height of the written surface. Apprentice assistants, who would have been less handy with the tools of their trade, produced these skimpy extensions. So that's my view of the workforce for this, for the illumination of the Free Library Quran, which, by the way, followed the copying of the Illumination followed the copying of the text, which required its own cadre of calligraphers. But how was the illumination work actually distributed within the codex itself? Was it according to the manuscript's material structure, so its quires, usually 8 or 10 bifolia, or some other gathering of bifolia? Or was it according to textual divisions, so by surah or juz? Or was there some kind of professional piecework system with senior illuminators given less to do in more time and apprentices more to do in less time? With luck, these questions may find answers as I continue to work on this manuscript, but meanwhile, I want to return to the one certainty about the manuscript that I noted at the outset, namely that it was made for and or used by an institution, as opposed to an individual. And now with what we know about the medallions, I think that we can also say that the overarching programmatic purpose of the manuscript's illumination was to create a visual language or code based on the logic of a certain visual vocabulary. Furthermore, and here I also am reiterating an earlier point, this visual language or artistic language was addressed to the readers or reciters within a religious setting or milieu who did not need written directions to follow the text. In other words, someone or someones was already well versed in the Quran, or perhaps had even memorized the entire text of 114 surahs and was familiar with the various textual divisions and the places for prostration. Such a person would have been a hafez, meaning a Muslim who knows the Quran by heart, or an imam who leads worship and prayers in a mosque or other Muslim community, as illustrated here in a late 13th century Persian manuscript. Now, in my heading, I mentioned this is Lewis, Oriental MS1. I know you all know that John Frederick Lewis collected many Islamic manuscripts as well as all the Western ones that you all study. But of course, John Frederick Lewis was neither a hafez nor an imam. The Philadelphia lawyer, bibliophile, and benefactor acquired much of his Islamic collection from auction houses and dealers in the United States and Europe during the 19-teens and 20s. Part of his pleasure as a collector apparently involved clipping out the relevant lot entries from catalogs and pasting them in the fly-leaf of his acquisitions, usually adding the purchase place and date in pencil. Manuscript 01 has such a paste-in, you see it here, although alas, no place or date of sale, and the free library records unfortunately provide no further information. But the catalog entry, while hyperbolic, hints at the expected impact of this codex on the rare book market, promoted as, quote, one of the very finest manuscripts of the Quran procurable, and speculates that such a finely written and splendidly illuminated volume would have been made for, quote, a powerful Mohammedan potentate. Such patronage seems unlikely, however, given that the power of Muslim rulers in India was considerably diminished during the period of British rule. But until such time as the Free Library Quran receives a more specific attribution, I trust that we now may agree that there is much to learn about the art and practice of illumination from the medallions in the margins. Thank you.
Okay, and I want to thank the audience for sticking around till the almost bitter end, and to make it bitter, here is Nick.
Well, I've just gotten a message saying that our reception, there are a few technical difficulties, but it's on its way for 5:30. So I thought, I'd make a few sort of closing remarks and maybe a launching off point for maybe a kind of broader discussion for the next few minutes. And I think, this has been an amazing conference, very, very rich, much to talk about. I'm so glad, though I haven't been able to be part of a lot of conversations because I and the other organizers have been running around a lot. It's been wonderful to see these conversations happening at the breaks, during the questions, at lunch, etc. I thought I would just sort of pick out a few themes that I thought really came to the fore over these past 2.5 days. First, some kind of overarching interpretive concepts that sort of seem to link a lot of the papers together, and then some more methodological considerations. So to begin with, and actually even in our first session, we heard a lot about narrativity and versus seriality, or maybe not necessarily narrativity, but sequentiality. So images that occur in sequence versus serial images that are repeated. And we saw, for example, in Laura's presentation, these gestural indications that point to kind of theatrical arts and that kind of lead the action along over a series of images within one manuscript. We heard from Alexandra about sequential narrative in manuscript and wall painting in Burma, and so shifting from the sequential narrative in palm leaf manuscripts to rooms with wall paintings where the narrative occurs in sequence. We heard as well from Christine in the Ethiopian context about serial images and also these amazing stencil manuscripts, these accordion-like stencil manuscripts, which present they present serial images, but they also present them sequentially. We're very transparent here. We're not hiding anything. And of course, we heard in Ben's paper about a kind of sequentiality with these three amazing images of Christ that kind of occur in this kind of proleptic fashion, that where meaning builds from one to another. Another sort of theme that I think came to the fore in a number of the papers, the impact of artistic importations as kind of disruptive of the status quo that can often engender a kind of broader reflection among artists and patrons about the relative value of different media. So we saw with Brian, we saw a lot of interregional movement within Italy that prompts different stylistic changes and different habits among individual illuminators. And we learned from him not to think of Italy, of course we think of it so regionally, of course we're taught to think of Italy as in the 15th century and 14th century as a place that's dominated by distinct city-states, but of course there's so much artistic movement that happens. We learned, going back to artistic production in Burma, the impact of Thai artists, right? So influxes of artists. This can happen for political reasons. It can happen for cultural reasons, military reasons. But the impact of an influx of artists, and we also saw again with Christine's talk in Ethiopia the changes that happen when Italian artisans, Venetian artisans, painters start coming to Ethiopia in the 15th century. We saw with Roger Jean Poyer, whose artwork changes in response to his travels to Italy, and lastly from Georgi about this amazing itinerancy of these forms that somehow make it from the Tang dynasty all the way to Byzantium. We also, another sort of theme, of course, is the specificity of manuscript illumination as a medium, but also the commonality of manuscript illumination with other media. So those two kind of opposite poles, and then the space in between. And of course, I'm sure many of you noticed the sort of subtitle of our conference, Manuscript Medium Message, is a kind of subtle allusion to Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message, right? And so how are the works of art we've discussed, how is their meaning sort of bound to their manuscriptness, and how is it aloof from that? How does it circulate? How does the meaning exist independently how does the message exist independently of the medium, rather? And we saw these issues kind of really nicely illustrated by Sonia's talk, where we saw that the lines between print and manuscript are blurred in this fascinating example from an English manuscript that copies an Italian incunable. And also a really interesting distinction that I think many of us are still thinking about, that Frederica Carmen drew on between the autograph and the allograph, right? The autographic techniques where an artist or a scribe is actually present and makes the work, versus allographic techniques where they provide a template and somebody else actually makes the work of art, so stained glass or tapestry, as opposed to manuscript illumination or panel painting. And of course, I think someone mentioned Sonia's recent article on writing as an ambographic medium, so something that's kind of in between the autograph and the allograph. Something that also came up, the value of citing or invoking another medium within manuscript illumination. And we saw that with Nancy's talk, where in these extraordinary details from Illuminations from Ferrara, where the oil painting technique is sort of mimicked within the manuscript illumination. So to what extent is an artist bound by the medium or the technique, and to what extent can they imitate aspects of another medium within their own medium? And we saw also with Ben's talk the kind of specificity of parchment as something that you can have the show through, the image on the other side that shows through. This can be used to artistic effect, and I'm sure we can think of other examples where this occurs in manuscript illumination. And of course, there are very few other media where that happens, although it happens, for example, in stained glass, where the reverse side of the glass can be painted to achieve a specific effect. And for those of us who participated in the workshop with Rosemary Butchek on Thursday, we kind of learned firsthand, right, the difference between using glare as a binding medium when illuminating a letter on a piece of parchment, and using the egg yolk when painting on panel. So I'm really glad we were able to integrate that into the program. Unfortunately, it was a closed workshop because we were limited in the numbers we could accommodate. But I'm glad that many of the speakers and our students, especially, and our members of conservation staff were able to participate in that. So in sum, what is particular to working on parchment and what is not? We also saw a lot of discussion of the problems dealing with fragmentary evidence that are really intrinsic to many of the papers we heard. So the loss of material, we heard Stella talk about the English example, the Westminster canopy and the Delisle Psalter. I mean, and Lucy mentioned at one point these, what are we missing? What are the kind of intermediary links? And we saw this also with Frederic and Carmen. What are the works of art that we're missing? The kind of connections where we see evident connections between two objects that we know were never in the same place, or that seem very improbable or disconnected. What are the intermediary works of art that are missing? Often we assume that they're drawings or model books, or sometimes, of course, illuminated manuscripts that must have existed. Along with that question, how do monumental compositions find their way into manuscripts and vice versa? How does this happen in a very literal, mechanical sense? Does the artist see a monumental work of art briefly? I mean, in some cases, it appears that, for example, Poirier might have seen works of art in Italy that he might have seen them in passing and recollected them. In other cases, we have citations that are so specific, and Susie showed many of these in the Prado triptych, attributed now by her to the master of the Collins Hours, these citations of Aikian paintings that must rely on intermediary drawings, right? Because how do you remember a work of art when you almost certainly can't have it in your workspace immediately? And then a kind of final sort of interpretive thread that I saw reoccur quite often, the trust or non-trust of documents and texts. So both of external documents that the document artists at work. So the example of André Bonneveau, again, that Susie mentioned. Sorry, that's not an external document. That's in the manuscript. No, it's not. It is. It's an inventory record that says that Bonneveau, this great sculptor, of course, painted the figures in this Psalter. But stylistically, it seems very problematic. So do we blindly or do we believe the document, or do we not? And also, even when there are signatures, as Renata showed, right? Even when we have a colophon that says, I wrote this text, or I painted this, illuminated this object. We in some cases we know that's just not true. So being critical about documents, and of course, again with Susie, this issue of Alengbrodt, this painter who was sort of artificially in the 20th century made into this great figure. And when we look at the documents really closely, we see that he can't be responsible for the works of art that have been ascribed to him. And then just to close, a few sort of larger methodological themes that came to the fore that I thought were really interesting. I was happy to hear in a number of talks about teaching students. How do we train the next generation of scholars to kind of understand works of art in multiple media? It really seems no longer sustainable to just train students to be a specialist in even just in manuscript illumination, or just in panel painting, or just in stained glass, or just in tapestry. So what kind of practices can we put into effect to train new generations of students, both undergraduates and graduates, in a kind of responsible way? And of course, Renata showed this in an exemplary fashion with her project, which is the fruit of multiple seminars that she's held here at Penn. Frederic and Carmen mentioned teaching their seminar annually in Geneva. I liked how Brian mentioned this riddle he gives students of having each of them work on a knot nama, like a portmanteau name that's been given to the same artist, and of course the students have eventually realized that they're dealing with the same artist. So problems of nomenclature, and of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conference, this course dovetails with the course that David, Kim, and I are teaching, a graduate course with 10 wonderful students, where we're thinking about these issues over the course of the semester. So for the speakers and for the people who've been present here, you've really made this a highlight of our semester. So thank you. A couple of final things. In terms of methodology, of course, the issue of connoisseurship came up a lot. Connoisseurship, which, in some circles seems like such a remote mode of interpretation and analysis that is something that was practiced, maybe in the mid-20th century, but not today. But of course, we still rely on it. We still rely on making comparisons and drawing conclusions based on visual evidence. And we saw that in many of the papers, and of course the promise of, but also the potential pitfalls of technical analysis, of infrared reflectography, of pigment analysis, of the analysis of binding agents in manuscript illumination. And as Stella and Paula have shown, there's so much to be learned, and we're really at the dawn of the age of the technical analysis of manuscript illumination. Of course, there have been isolated attempts earlier in the 20th century to apply some of the techniques that have been applied to panel painting for many decades, but Stella and Paula are really trying to do this in a more systematic way. And we talked, I think, at lunch a little bit about as we embark on this kind of new era of the technical analysis of illuminated manuscripts, how do we sort of avoid the pitfalls of for example, the underdrawing craze of the sort of 1970s, 1980s, and I draw your attention to an interesting recent article by Noah Terrell about this historiographic episode of always trying to get back to the underdrawing. And I also want to mention Marian Ainsworth, who is an amazing source of knowledge about the issues we've been talking about. And actually, she was going to speak. Of course, we invited her, and she was going to speak. But she's at CASVA this year on a fellowship, and they've saddled her with all sorts of responsibilities. So she does regret not being here. But she's written also very eloquently about the promise and also the potential caveats of relying on technical analysis, both with analyzing panel paintings and also manuscript illumination. And then finally, all these advances in scholarship and all these discoveries we've made and that you've presented, which are so fascinating, and how these new discoveries sometimes overturn previous hypotheses in very dramatic ways, or sometimes validate previous hypotheses, right? Which can be equally interesting. The Bury Bible, right? The Master Hugo being an artist who understood Greek, right? Who was trained in the Byzantine tradition at least, kind of validates a previous hypothesis that's based on style. And similarly, Jean Poyet's travels to Italy, where there's sort of a general understanding that he has an Italianate style, but then Roger has helped to sort of isolate these specific instances that kind of validate this previous supposition. But then, of course, on the other hand, new discoveries that overturn previous assumptions. And of course, Susie showed that in her keynote with the Prado triptych and Louis Alenbrot. And also actually Frederic and Carmen with Les Phalanx and not Les Phalanx in the Louvre. This very large painting, important French painting attributed to this Provençal artist, José Les Phalanx, and which they've shown is actually was actually the main altarpiece of the Parliament of Dijon. And so in some cases, these new discoveries resolve long-standing unease or doubt, an attribution that's maybe been given, but no one's really very comfortable with it. So I find that it's interesting to kind of reflect on these, the effect of some of the new discoveries we're making. So I'm sure there are many other themes we could discuss, but I wanted to sort of try to at least summarize. It's always difficult to do, and if anyone has any further comments, did Will run back with something? Oh, he's there. Okay. Are we ready for our reception, Will?
Well, no, we should comment for a little while.
So any comments? Any questions? Will?
I have a comment. First of all, I thought it was a completely fantastic conference. But there was when I actually looked at manuscripts, I remember reading C.R. Dodwell on the Canterbury School of Illumination, and he had lots of textiles from Byzantium, and I just wondered. And the hypothesis was that they were influencing Canterbury initials, and they did look the same. But now I'm thinking of the Berry Bible, and I'm thinking of the Byzantine blossoms in the Berry Bible. I'm thinking of the fantastic Frater Ambrosius page and the repeated motifs around the edge of the Moses scene. I mean, these things I think do come from Byzantium, and I think that the letters that Stella and Paula found are indicative of that, and I'm very grateful to Georgi to taking it back to China for me. I do think that the spread of this is great, and I love the notion that these broad leaps that people are making can be filled in by technical analysis. I think it's fantastic. And for me, that was the takeaway of this conference, is that technical analysis is really beginning to power home and make a real difference to our field, and it's fantastic.
Ben, maybe...
I was struck by... Georgi, I liked your point. I really appreciated your point about eclecticism in the Macedonian quote-unquote Renaissance. And it got me thinking about attribution as well, and the presence of different hands, the presence of different people working in books, in panel paintings, in all these places, as a kind of eclecticism of its own, not necessarily a sort of multicultural stylistic eclecticism, but a kind of maybe more personal eclecticism. And so as someone who hasn't worked much on that kind of mixed process or mixed working process, I was just wondering if any of there's so many people here who do know, who have thought more deeply about that than I ever have had a chance to. If you'd agree that eclecticism is maybe a way to think about these kinds of, and also maybe a way to bust up as I was saying in a conversation with someone earlier, that the hero worship that often accompanies this attribution of hands and this attribution of masters, and to think about it more broadly as just, many hands, many styles. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that, but that's one thought I had. Roger. Did you say Rogers? Or not?
Busy hero worship.
No one wants to answer Ben's question?
That's fine.
Nancy has an answer.
Well, I feel like what I was trying to do was kind of trying to bust up some of that hero worship by trying to parse, certain passages within the Illumination. But the questions a lot of you kept asking me was, where's the meaning in all of it? And I think that's something that those of us doing the technical analysis need help with. And just because you all are asking different questions than we are, but I think there needs to be that openness to consider all the different parts, because what we're all talking about are things that are multi-part, and we know that these are done over spaces of time by many, many hands, but there still seems to be that monolithic tradition in our field and historiographically to need the name, need the master, and there just still seems to be that unwillingness to consider alternatives, which are being turned up, I'm sorry, by underdrawing. So, and that's a question I have for you, Nick, that comment about sort of the reticence to accept it. I feel like, the whole, material turn and all of that is really a result of 40 years of conservation science and research that, yes, manuscript is late to, but that's been going on for a couple, several generations now. So to not acknowledge or to try to, anyway, I don't know, but
I wasn't endorsing the idea of like an underdrawings craze as something bad or something that even, people have mentioned it as a kind of, a historical episode that happened in the 70s and 80s, and then of course the underdrawings weren't the solution to all the attributional problems, at least in early Netherlandish painting.
And I'll say this, that with underdrawings and manuscripts, I should have said this before, are tricky because it's hard to distinguish really what's under and what's on top. So I think that's something we have to really look at carefully. And again, it's the improvement of the devices that are really helping.
Yeah. And the Poirier underdrawings that Roger showed, those are really distinct and interesting.
Yeah. Just a code to that, just to echo Nancy, that it is invaluable when you can see a distinctive underdrawing style. But I agree with you that the craze for underdrawings can take us too far in a wishful thinking alley, where we want to see an underdrawing that looks like another underdrawing or like a drawing. So the kind of close looking that Roger did with Poirier and the close looking that Nancy does, what I want to say is, as somebody who felt challenged when we were first starting looking at underdrawings, it actually takes time and very close looking to learn how to read underdrawings. Right. So just a word of caution, don't get too excited by underdrawings.
I think that we can expand this conversation and address an issue that was brought up by Nick with respect to documents and archival work, which is to say that we shouldn't really always be looking at documents and archives as proof or further evidence than the works of art, because they require judgments themselves in determining whether they're authentic. But what I think they are especially valuable for is testifying to the values of the society that wrote those documents. So in a society that writes documents that apportions each aspect of an illuminated page, a vignette was made by this person, whereas the historiation was done by this person, well, then that justifies looking for multiple hands in the underdrawing, whereas documents that do not name names should warn us away from using those methods for solving attributional problems. So I think that we can expand our analyses by taking into account where it exists, that information, and then using it to guide us toward what sorts of questions we can ask when we see references between media.
Sure. So looking for a kind of emic notion, a notion of authorship internal to the culture we're examining, without imposing a kind of later structure upon it. Sure.
So I just wanted to refer to something that Ben's talk made me think about, which is the idea of mediation. And it seems as if we've been circling around different definitions of medium and mediate, and then your reference to McLuhan and mass media. And I think one of I really appreciate the idea that we do need the technical analysis and all of that information that we can learn. And I think in part we've understood what we need to learn because we've broadened the media that we're willing to look at. And so the kinds of connections that now we're making require and can profit from the analysis of paint and all of this technology that is now available. And we need to collaborate across institutions to be able to find that information. But medium and mediate, when we're thinking about these objects, I think we also need to remember that to mediate is between an audience and the object, and within a particular context. And I think that, in terms of Nancy's question about meaning, I think we do need to remember, and also as a collaborative venture, to think about when objects move from one context to another. If we are preoccupied with the hand, then we're not necessarily thinking about what that means when a figure appears in a manuscript as opposed to when it appears in an altarpiece. And that's part of the mediation of objects that hinges on both a context and an exchange between an object and an audience. And I think we've all thought about, if we want to come back to an original moment and the hand of the maker, that's one aspect of how mediation happens. But our experience of these objects are in terms of an audience and an object, and imagining a particular historical context in which that object was meant to mean. So then I thank you for your paper that brought mediation back into the discussion.
Roger.
The technical analysis of the manuscripts and the illuminations and the panel paintings are very revealing. But I think also back to points that Frederick and Carmen made about you also have to learn how to see, and the teaching of connoisseurship and seeing, being able to see, because if you don't have the eyes with which to interpret the results of this technological advancement, it will be as if it's covered, before your eyes. So I still think old-fashioned connoisseurship and learning how to look and see is still ultimately very important to be used concomitantly with the technical information that we are now being given.
I think that's a great point, and I think that it's easy to sort of despair and say that that it's there's so much we're supposed to teach students other than connoisseurship, and there's so little time, and it's very difficult for students to travel, let alone to have courses that travel to look at works of art, and it's can be difficult and complicated to get access to manuscripts in teaching, of course. But of course, there's the promise of the digital age too, for at least for the connoisseurship of illuminated manuscripts, and now that we have access to thousands and thousands of digitized manuscripts, I mean, it really does transform what a student who's interested in the material can do and can learn. And of course, it's important. It's always important, especially when making attributions, to see the original object and understand the three-dimensionality of the object. But I mean, until one does that, I mean, using digital images is just extraordinary. I mean, if you tell students to spend, as an assignment, to spend 2 hours a week on Gallica or on Bibliophily looking at manuscripts, I think what they find is amazing, and that also, it's an activity that does need to be structured. You need to sort of tell them what to look for, but I mean, it's also a generation ago that it would have been a fantasy, right? So I think it's promising. I mean, I don't think it's a time where we necessarily need to worry about those skills disappearing. I think we can renew them.
Is that while many, many, many people can claim rightly to have contributed to the wonderful success of the last 3 days, the presiding genius behind it was Nick Herman. And we are so grateful to him for arranging something that really has opened my eyes as a theme, which is medieval illuminators are part of a matrixed organization, and they are doing everything. So Nick, thank you very much indeed.